And so the notes that I have given you contain a lot more information, references, and so forth than we'll be able to talk about today. But if you read those notes, if you have further questions from the notes, you could either email me or just Google up the subject matter that's referenced in the notes and get more information about it. I like the source Wikipedia. It's an online encyclopedia that is contributed to by a lot of notable scholars. It usually presents both sides of an issue. It gives you the pros and the cons of things. For example, if you wanted to see what Wikipedia thinks about who wrote the book of 2 Thessalonians, if you go there and Google it up, it will give you the body of scholarship that supports that maybe the Apostle Paul wrote that, or it'll give you the body of scholarship that maybe it was not the Apostle Paul that wrote that. So I think that's usually a decent source. Hey. I want to give you just a little bit of background of some factors here. You know, it was about 50 years after the crucifixion of Christ that there was a Roman poet. His name was Martial, I guess it's Martial, and he wrote a poem in which he was extolling a new thing that had come about, that it was really going to help him in his profession, and that was being able to write on a codex rather than a scroll. Now he was going to be able to write in pages, and those pages he could write on both the front and the back, and they could be bound, and somebody come up with this idea, and so no longer was he going to have to write all this out on a scroll and have something like this that he would have to tote around. No one else could read it unless he handed it to them and so forth. The advantages of the invention of being able to write in this manner had a tremendous impact on Christianity. Imagine just at about the time that Christianity was starting to really spread, there was this new technique for capturing things in writing in a manner that could be written on pages front and back, could be bound in leather, laced together, and passed around and handed down, and so forth. And one obvious great advantage is that you can go to the middle of the book. You don't have to start at the front and work your way through, because you can turn over and go into the middle of the book. So along with the printing press, probably that the codex was the greatest invention as far as disseminating information in history. So do we have does anyone have a copy they can share?
We can share.
Nice to see you. Yes.
Thank you.
So that I attribute that invention to really the early spread of Christianity and these books that started to be formed. So in the first 100 years after Christ, as Christianity was really taking hold, there were books written, tons of books, lots of books. Those books were passed around. Someone would use someone else's book to write a book, and so forth. So I want to jump ahead, though, that there came a time when there was a series of books that had pretty much come to be accepted as the what later became known as the New Testament canon. This was 27 books that, but it was not until 367 that, which was 330 years after the crucifixion of Christ, it was not until 367 that these 27 books came together and were acknowledged as this is the New Testament canon. It was this, our friend Athanasius that we talked about in another class, having a great influence on at the Council of Nicaea and defining Christ's relationship to God. He was also instrumental in establishing the original edict that named these 27 books. And in 367, he sent out his, he was from Alexandria. He was a bishop in Alexandria, and he sent out his 39th festal epistle to all of his churches, in which he said, "These books are the wells of salvation, so that he who thirsts may be satisfied with the sayings in these. Let no one add to these, let nothing be taken away." So you see, this was the first thing that we have in writing that said this is the New Testament. These are the 27 books that comprise the New Testament. If anyone can share notes with anyone, it would be great, because new folks are coming in, and because there is one or two charts that are in the notes that we're going to be taking a look at in just a few minutes. So, then it was Athanasius got this out, and then it was in I think I had it in my notes here, 397, I believe, that Augustine reinforced this by getting out sort of the same letter, saying that these are the 27 books that are acknowledged as the source of our Gospels and so forth. But he also included in his list some other books. And he said, now these books over here, you can read and you can study. They're all right. They're not heresy, but they are not a part of the 27. The 27 stand alone. So that's sort of how that came to be. And one of the things we're going to talk about today is the fact that there were other books. There were books that got lost. There were books that were burned because they were considered not in the mainstream orthodoxy of the time, so forth. So how do we know this? One of the ways that we know it is that some of these books are referred to actually in Scripture itself. I put some examples in here. 1 Corinthians is presumed to be 1 Corinthians, but in 1 Corinthians, Paul says, "I wrote to you in my letter not to associate with sexually immoral people," not at all meaning the people of this world who are immoral or greedy and swindlers or idolaters. In that case, you would have to leave the world. But now I am writing you that you must not associate with anyone and so forth. So he's saying, I wrote you another letter. And I told you this. Now I'm telling you again. But this is 1 Corinthians. So there's another one that we don't have. So that's an example of a lost gospel right there. It's the same thing he refers to in Colossians. Paul refers to a lost letter to the Laodiceans. It says, "And when this letter has been read among you," this is to the Colossians, "have it read in the church of the Laodiceans, and see that you also read the letter from them." So he refers to a letter that we don't have anymore. So I want to give these examples to show that we're working around to the Q gospel, but that there are examples right in the Bible of where books are referenced as being lost. There are also references in the Bible to books that were written, that perhaps were written to take a counter view of the book that the person was talking about. And I gave 2 Thessalonians as an example of that, where whoever wrote 2 Thessalonians said, "Thus not to become easily unsettled or alarmed by the teaching allegedly from us, whether by a prophecy or word or mouth or by letter." So if Paul wrote 2 Thessalonians, he's saying there's another letter out there circulating around. Don't be fooled by that letter, Now, here's the thing. Most scholars, I say most scholars, and I want to interrupt myself to say, when we say scholars think, scholars believe, scholars have concluded, no, that's a little bit tricky, because that doesn't ever mean all scholars. It doesn't even sometimes mean a half of the scholars. But I've tried in my notes to be a little specific to that and say, if I say most scholars, that means I have researched that and I have reached that conclusion that it is most scholars. And if I say that 90% of the scholars say that there was an existence at one time of what is now referred to as the Q gospel, then that's what I have researched and found out. But it's still, even at a place like Princeton, and some of our pastors would know that, that you go there and you can have two professors that disagree wholeheartedly about some fairly basic thing. And they even hardly speak to each other. They write books against each other. So there's never, when we say scholars believe, we have to say, well, how many scholars? It's just one scholar believe, you know, so forth. So I've tried to get a little specific about it, that in my notes, but in Second Thessalonians is tricky because now most scholars, I would say more than half the scholars, don't believe that Paul wrote Second Thessalonians. So here's a book that's saying that there's somebody else out there writing a book in my name, but the person that wrote the book he's doing exactly what he's accusing someone else of doing, you know. But these things are not as sinister as you think when you really get down to it. It's not people that would write a book back in those days in someone else's name. It was not in a way of doing anything wrong. It would be like me writing a book and I would want somebody to read it, so I would say Bill Wallop wrote it. So, but, you know, because who's going to read a book that I wrote? So if someone that was a disciple of Paul, that really preached and led his people the way that Paul did, there would be nothing wrong with him saying, I'm going to say that Paul wrote this. He's not trying to write something different from what he thinks that Paul would have said. Yes?
Well, just to reinforce that, in the schools of rhetoric, it was a very common assignment to write a speech in the name of Julius Caesar. And so if you wanted to graduate from the school of rhetoric, you wrote a speech, short or long, in the name, not your own name, but Julius Caesar or some famous person. So, yeah, I think you're right. It's not devious, but it was
That's
very
right.
common.
It's not.
It's very common,
That's
yeah.
right.
Yeah.
So that, some of that went on, and Second Thessalonians is an example of that, of a book that, and you know, this biblical scholarship and historical criticism, as it's called, there are hundreds and thousands of scholars who work on this all the time, and it's almost like they're forensic pathologists. They get in and dig out the details. How would you know who wrote this and who wrote that? How do they find out some of these things, and where do they reach the conclusions that they reach? And a lot of times, like Second Thessalonians is a good example. If you only had Second Thessalonians to look at, you would swear that Paul probably wrote it. But when you lay it down beside another book that Paul wrote, you say, wait a minute, I don't think the same two people wrote this. Because it'd be like if I gave you 17 books that I had written and you read all 17 of them, then I gave you 3 more, and I say, here are 3 more books that I've written, and you read those, and I kept using the word in these 3 books, au contraire. You know, well, you said, well, what's going on? He never said au contraire before. Now in these 3 books, he's using 150 times. So that's the kind of thing they're looking for. But even those kinds of things are not always persuasive. Like you take 1st and 2nd Timothy and Titus, pastoral books. They are not thought of generally now in scholarship as being written by Paul, because they contain words that Paul never used before. There are some 300 words used in those 3 books that don't appear in the books that are normally attributed to Paul. But here again, so what? You know? So it's like when Pastor Hall taught on the book of James. He said we could have, it was a great course. We could have spent some time talking about who wrote the book of James, but I never will forget that Pastor Hall said, well, let's see what James tells us. It's not important who wrote it. And he said, somebody wrote it. So that's where we are. Somebody wrote these books. And I've spent on too much of my life of worrying about finding contradictions in the Bible, discrepancies, where one thing doesn't add up to another thing and all of that. I found that was a total waste of time, really, because It's what the Bible says to us is what's important. It's not whether this fact stacks up against that fact. We're approaching the Christmas season now, and we read in Luke the story of the wise men and the wise men. It was